I work as a school lunch lady and live in a small house in Plymouth, Massachusetts. All my life, I've brought my family together around the table. For Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, especially Thanksgiving. Turkey, pumpkin pie, cornbread. I cooked everything myself, with love, without expectations. This year, I set the table again, but no one came, because all of them, my son, his wife, my granddaughter, my niece, even the neighbor I always saved pie for, went to her place, my ex-husband's new wife, and it wasn't just a visit, they made it a celebration, while I sat at an empty table. So I picked up the phone. Because sometimes, if you want people to see what they've done, you have to hold up a mirror. And after that, I didn't have to say a single word. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Diane Mercer. I was 62 years old and had been working as a school cafeteria cook for nearly 30 years. I lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of Plymouth, Massachusetts. The kind of house with faded shutters and a porch that creaked when the wind picked up. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and every year, without fail, it became the heart of Thanksgiving for my family. I began preparing a week in advance. I always did. It was a ritual, a rhythm built from decades of tradition and memory. My kitchen became a battlefield of checklists and grocery bags. I started with the menu, written out in cursive on a yellow legal pad I kept tucked in a drawer with my mother's old recipes. I wasn't one to experiment. Thanksgiving wasn't about reinvention. It was about comfort, about the smells that reached deep into the walls and reminded you where you came from. 2 turkeys, one roasted traditionally with sage and butter, the other brined in apple cider and herbs, mashed potatoes with heavy cream and garlic, green bean casserole made from scratch, not the canned soup version, cranberry sauce chilled in a crystal dish, sweet potatoes with brown sugar and pecans, and of course, my cornbread stuffing with celery and onions, toasted just enough to crackle under a fork. I drove to the same farm I had visited for the last 15 years to pick up fresh produce. The woman at the counter remembered me. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about the weather, and she complimented my scarf. That kind of small talk feels warm when you don't have much else. Back home, I spent the day washing, peeling, chopping, organizing. I labeled plastic containers, arranged herbs by bundle, prepared dough for 2 pumpkin pies and 1 pecan, the latter requested by my son years ago and now a permanent fixture, whether he asked or not. I ironed my tablecloth. It was cream-colored with little embroidered pumpkins near the edges, stitched by hand by my sister before she passed. I set it gently across the table and smoothed it with my palms. Then came the plates, white porcelain with gold trim, my mother's. I only brought them out twice a year. I dusted each one with a soft cloth, lining them in a circle around the table. 7 settings, forks on the left, knives and spoons on the right, cloth napkins folded into tidy triangles, tucked under the forks. I lit one of my good candles that evening, cinnamon and clove, and let it burn while I cleaned. I hummed to myself, letting music fill the corners of the house as I polished wine glasses and checked the batteries in the fairy lights wrapped around the banister. The guest list wasn't large. My son Scott, his wife Sarah, their daughter Emma, my niece Rachel and her boyfriend, Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor, who had nowhere else to go and always brought a tin of cookies that tasted like dust and affection. I had sent out invites by hand weeks earlier, small cards with watercolor turkeys and a line of script that read, "Join me for Thanksgiving, food, warmth, and a place at the table." Everyone had replied, some with words, some with emojis, but no one said they couldn't come. The thought of all of them in one room again made my heart swell. I imagined Scott carving the turkey while Emma handed out napkins. Sarah politely complimenting the stuffing before picking at her salad. Laughter over pie. Wine poured slowly. Quiet moments between bites, filled with that heavy, comforting silence only families share when they know they belong to each other. I pulled the good chairs out of the basement and dusted them off. I hung the paper leaf garlands across the windows. I placed little name cards at each seat. It was silly, maybe, but I believed those small gestures mattered. They were my way of saying, you are expected, you are wanted, you are part of this. That night, I stood in the doorway of the dining room and admired the setup. Everything looked perfect. Everything was in place. The house was clean. The fridge was full. My hands were tired, but my spirit was light. I took a picture of the table and sent it to Scott with the caption, "Can't wait to see everyone tomorrow." He didn't respond. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I turned off the kitchen light, climbed into bed, and set my alarm for 6 a.m. The turkey would need to go in by 9. I had pies to finish, salad to dress, gravy to stir, but it didn't feel like work. It felt like love, the kind you can taste, the kind that fills a house before a single word is spoken. And I believed with all my heart that they would come. I woke up before the alarm. The sky was still dark outside my window, and the house was silent, resting in that hushed moment before the day began. I lay in bed for a minute, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint whistle of wind against the glass. Then I sat up, wrapped myself in my robe, and made my way to the kitchen. I turned on the oven, preheated it to 325 degrees, and began my Thanksgiving routine. The turkey, already seasoned and stuffed, was pulled from the fridge and placed carefully into the roasting pan. I basted it once, covered it with foil, and slid it into the oven. A familiar rhythm returned to my body as I moved around the kitchen, the comforting choreography of years of repetition. My hands knew what to do even when my heart raced ahead. By 9, the smells were already seeping into the walls. Rosemary, thyme, butter, garlic. I put on music, something soft and instrumental. I opened the curtains to let in the morning light. It was cold outside, but clear. A good day. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old magazine. I wasn't reading. I was counting time. By 11, the house was warm, alive with the sounds of pots clinking, timers going off, my footsteps crossing between stove and sink. I checked my phone. No new messages. I sent a simple text to Scott. "Hope you're all on the way. Drive safe." I added a leaf emoji. It felt festive, light. No reply. At noon, I dressed. I wore a burgundy sweater and a necklace Emma had made me years ago, with plastic beads and a crooked heart in the center. I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was pinned back, my cheeks a little flushed from the kitchen heat. I smiled and turned away, ready. By 1, everything was ready. The table was set, candles lit, food arranged on the counter like a display from a cooking show. I took pictures of everything. I had a tradition of making a photo album every year, Thanksgiving memories across time. I imagined this one would have the best spread yet. I stood by the window and looked outside. No cars. I poured myself a glass of sparkling cider and waited. At 2, I sat on the couch, thinking maybe someone would arrive early and help me carry in extra chairs. I imagined Scott juggling a pie and Emma's coat, Sarah walking behind him, already annoyed about something small. I imagined my niece Rachel laughing at nothing in particular, and Mrs. Henderson struggling up the steps with her tin of cookies. It played like a movie in my head, so clearly that for a second I believed it was happening. But the driveway remained empty. At 3, I started to worry. I texted again. "Everything's hot and ready when you are." No reply. I called Scott. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I tried again, straight to voicemail. I sat back, trying to stay calm, telling myself they were probably running late or maybe forgot to charge their phones. I walked to the window again. Still no one. I went into the dining room and straightened the napkins, then the forks, then the name cards, though none of them needed fixing. I lit the candles again even though they didn't need it either. Then I sat down in my seat at the head of the table and waited. At 4 o'clock, I checked social media. I opened Instagram and saw nothing at first, but then I tapped on Emma's story out of instinct. There it was, a picture of a long table, crowded with people, dishes in the center, paper decorations strung across the wall. I recognized my son, my granddaughter, Rachel, even Mrs. Henderson. They were all smiling, plates full. A golden brown turkey sat in the middle, not mine. The caption read, "Thanksgiving done right. Thanks for making it special, Kelly." Kelly, my ex-husband's new wife. The woman who had always smiled too wide when I was near. The woman who had hosted a few holidays before, but only after mine. The woman I hadn't spoken to since she sent me a wedding invitation with my ex's last name on it, written in gold script like a dare. They had gone there, all of them. No one had told me. No one had declined. No one had said a word. I sat in silence staring at the phone. The warmth from the kitchen had become suffocating. The smell of food that once comforted me now made my stomach twist. I stood up slowly and walked back into the kitchen. The turkey had been resting under foil for over an hour. The mashed potatoes were now lukewarm. The green beans had lost their crunch. The candles flickered in still air, untouched by breath or movement. I turned off the oven. I turned off the music. I stood there alone, listening to the quiet sound of nothing happening. Then I did the only thing I could do. I walked over to the table. I picked up my glass, and I toasted to no one. The next morning, I woke up with a strange kind of stillness inside me. Not the dull ache of disappointment from the day before, but something heavier, more solid. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone to ask why. I just lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, listening to the faint hum of my own breathing. The house still smelled like Thanksgiving. Spices, roasted meat, butter, and sugar lingered in the air like ghosts of a dinner that never happened. I walked into the kitchen in my robe, bare feet against the cool tile. The countertops were still full, pans, pie tins, covered dishes. I hadn't put anything away. I couldn't bring myself to. It felt like erasing proof that I had tried. I stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table. The plates were still there, untouched. The wine glasses sat exactly where I had placed them, their surfaces catching the morning light. The name cards looked ridiculous now, like something from a forgotten play. I stepped forward and slowly began to collect them. I held Emma's card for a moment, staring at the little drawing I had doodled in the corner, a heart with a smiley face. I placed it gently in a drawer, alone. Then I saw my phone on the kitchen counter, still plugged in, fully charged, and I thought, if they could post their version of Thanksgiving, maybe it was time for mine. I walked into the hallway, opened the closet, and pulled out the small tripod I had bought years ago for a craft video project I never finished. I dusted it off, attached the phone, and positioned it at the far end of the dining room, framing the full table. The light from the window behind it was soft, grayish, perfect. I pressed record. I sat down at the head of the table. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't even look into the camera. I simply acted out what Thanksgiving was supposed to be. I poured wine into each glass, carefully, slowly, the way I always did, generous, but never spilling. I picked up the serving spoon and began to dish mashed potatoes onto plates, one by one, moving clockwise, then green beans, then stuffing, then turkey. I didn't rush. I moved as if I were serving real people. I looked at each place setting as I placed the food. I smiled softly at an empty chair. I nodded to another, the way I might have if someone had said something kind. I lifted my own fork, took a small bite of turkey, and chewed. I toasted again, to no one. But this time, I raised the glass with intention. I held it there for a moment before taking a sip. The silence was complete. No music, no voices, just the quiet clink of metal on porcelain, the shuffle of cloth napkins, the distant hum of the refrigerator. I sat in that silence for 7 minutes. Then I stood up, walked to the camera, and stopped the recording. I didn't know what I would do with it yet. At first, I thought maybe I would just save it, tuck it away like a keepsake no one else would ever see. But something about it felt important. Not performative, not emotional, just necessary. It was documentation, evidence, not of pain, but of effort, not of a ruined holiday, but of presence, my presence. I watched the video once, and it broke something in me, not in a way that shattered, but in a way that exposed. A quiet excavation of everything I had kept hidden behind smiles and recipes and polite texts. Watching myself move through that empty room, serving a meal to ghosts, made the truth so painfully clear. I had been holding space for people who didn't value it. They had chosen someone else's table, someone else's warmth, and left me with mine, still full, still beautiful, still waiting. The recording didn't ask for pity. It didn't beg for forgiveness or attention. It simply showed what was real. That night, I opened the family group chat. It hadn't been used in months. The last message was a picture of Emma's school play back in the spring. I hovered over the video file, then pressed send. No caption, no emojis, no comments, just the raw, quiet footage. And then I turned off the phone, placed it face down on the counter, and walked into the living room. I didn't expect a reaction, but I wanted them to see, not what they missed, but what they chose to ignore. I sat in the living room for a long time after I sent the video. The television was on, but I wasn't watching. Some holiday cooking show played in the background, filled with the usual laughter, warm lighting, and polished countertops. The kind of world where no one is forgotten, where every plate has a hand reaching for it, where no one eats alone. I stared at the screen, not seeing any of it, and kept my phone face down on the end table. It buzzed once, twice. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. I had already decided I wouldn't be part of the performance that always followed hurt in our family. The scramble to explain, to justify, to smooth it all over like it hadn't happened. That was the part I had always played. The fixer, the forgiver, the one who covered for everyone else's lack of care. Not this time. The house was quiet. The food still sat in the fridge. The table was half cleared now, plates stacked, but not put away. I moved through the afternoon like I was gliding underwater. My steps felt slow, my thoughts thick, but beneath the heaviness, there was something else, not anger, not grief. It was something colder, sharper, clarity. They had made a choice, maybe not all together, maybe not with malice, but a choice nonetheless. And choices have weight. Not every decision needs to be cruel to be cruelly felt. I walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and started packing the food away properly. I separated everything into containers, some for freezing, some to give away, some to throw out. I worked in silence, my hands steady, my movements deliberate. I didn't feel bitter. I felt done. When I finished, I made myself a plate, reheated it, and sat at the table, alone. I ate quietly, watching the candlelight flicker against the window pane. Outside, the sky had gone pale, the edges of the horizon tinted with the last blush of daylight. Another holiday come and gone. I cleaned the dishes. I wiped the counters. I swept the floor. Everything returned to order, to stillness. Then I turned my phone over. 10 notifications, 1 from my niece, 3 from Scott, 1 from Sarah, 2 from Emma. The rest were reactions in the group chat. Thumbs up, heart, sad face. I opened the message thread, scrolling slowly. The first was from Sarah. Is this supposed to be a guilt trip? Then Rachel, why didn't you say anything before? You never mentioned we weren't supposed to go. Then Scott, Mom, what is this? Are you okay? Then Emma, Grandma. I closed the app. They weren't ready to look at it. Not really. They were still framing it around themselves, around what it made them feel, not what it meant, not what it revealed. I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one, a quiet illumination of everything I already knew. I went back into the dining room and removed the last of the decorations. I folded the tablecloth. I washed the wine glasses by hand. I didn't rush. I wasn't trying to erase the day. I was preparing the space for something new, something honest, something that didn't depend on who showed up. Later, I lay in bed with the lights off, my phone still silent beside me. I imagined them watching the video in their separate homes, on their separate devices. I wondered what they noticed. The silence, the food, the care. Did they feel the emptiness I sat inside of, or did they just see it as a display? I didn't know, and I didn't reach for answers. Sending the video wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. Truth with no soundtrack, no confrontation, no lecture. Just a quiet, unedited moment that said, I was here, I showed up, and you didn't. For the first time in years, I felt like I had spoken without raising my voice, and I had been heard, even if no one wanted to admit it. The day after Thanksgiving felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. The house had returned to its normal state. The dishes were cleaned and put away. The decorations were boxed and stored back in the hallway closet. No signs of the day before remained, except inside me. I stayed off my phone that morning. I made tea and sat by the window, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the wind pull the last leaves from the trees. The branches swayed like they were letting go of something they'd held too long. I knew that feeling well. When I finally turned my phone back on, there were more messages, some from Scott, a few from Sarah, one more from Emma, short and unsure. A couple of relatives had reacted to the video with emojis that tried too hard to soften what had happened. No one apologized. Not really. Most said things like, "We didn't mean to hurt you," or "You should have said something," or "We assumed it would be okay." Assumed. That word stuck to me like dust. What none of them said was, "We chose someone else. We left you alone. We made you invisible." Instead, they danced around it, skirted the truth with platitudes and defense. They didn't acknowledge the reality, that I had been replaced, not because of something I did, but because they had stopped seeing me as essential, stopped seeing me as someone whose effort, presence, or love needed to be considered. I wasn't angry. I was numb. I didn't respond, not out of pettiness, but because there was nothing left to say. The silence wasn't punishment. It was space. Space they had created when they walked away. Space I now allowed to exist between us because I no longer felt the need to fill it. That weekend, I didn't cook. I didn't call. I didn't send photos of leftovers or check-ins or thinking of you texts. I didn't remind anyone of birthdays or ask for visits or offer help with school projects. I didn't offer my time, my energy, my emotional labor. I withdrew it like someone closing a faucet that had been running too long. And they noticed. The silence at first felt awkward. Then it grew uncomfortable. And by Sunday evening, it turned into concern. They wanted me to respond, to say something, to break the tension, to make it all okay again, because that's what I had always done. I had been the one to smooth things over, to explain, to justify their behavior so they wouldn't have to say, it's fine, even when it wasn't, to move forward for the sake of peace. But peace built on silence is a false peace, and I was done building it alone. I watched their names flash on my screen again and again, voice messages I didn't open. One from Rachel that was almost accusatory. It was just a dinner. But it wasn't. It was a pattern, and patterns become truths when they're repeated enough times. I had spent years stitching together a sense of family, thread by thread, with meals and traditions and thoughtful gestures. I had poured myself into making holidays feel whole, and when they all chose another table, they didn't just miss a dinner, they tore the seam. Now they wanted me to pretend the fabric wasn't ripped. I took long walks around the neighborhood, past other homes with decorations still clinging to their porches. I wondered how many other women like me were sitting behind those doors, quietly enduring the weight of being forgotten. I walked until the cold nipped at my skin and the wind pressed into my coat. And when I came home, I didn't reach for my phone. I reached for a notebook. I wrote about the silence, not as an enemy, but as a companion. I wrote about the way it clarified things, how it stripped away the noise of obligation and guilt. I wrote about how much of myself I had given away in the name of being included, how often I had accepted less than kindness and called it love. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't expected. I found peace, not the fragile kind that needs to be negotiated, but the kind that lives in truth, in knowing who I am, even when others forget, in knowing what I gave, even when they chose not to show up. The silence no longer scared me, because I finally realized I wasn't waiting to be heard. I was listening to myself. I never meant for the video to spread beyond the family. When I sent it to the group chat, it was a private gesture, a moment between us, a quiet mirror held up so they could see what they had done, what they had chosen. But silence has a strange way of creating noise in the wrong places. And before long, the recording that began in my dining room made its way into hands I never expected. It started with a message from a woman I barely knew, a parent from the school where I used to work. She said she saw my video and that it moved her, that it reminded her of her own mother, of the dinner she'd skipped last year and never made right. I stared at the message for a long time, wondering how she'd even gotten it. Then I found out. Sarah, perhaps out of misplaced guilt or an attempt to gain sympathy, had forwarded the video to a friend. That friend had posted it on Facebook with a long caption about family and the people we take for granted. From there, it spread. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't mentioned by name. But the table, the room, my hands pouring wine into empty glasses, it was all there. And soon, so were the comments. Thousands. People called me brave. Others called me heartbroken. Some called it manipulative. Some saw art. Others saw pain. But the most surprising thing was how many people saw themselves. They wrote things like, "This was my grandmother last year," and "I never knew how much it must have hurt." Messages poured in from strangers, most kind, some invasive, and a few who tried to turn it into spectacle. I didn't respond to any of them. I just watched. And then the calls started again. But this time, they weren't just texts from family. They were calls from reporters, producers, influencers asking if I'd be willing to talk, to share my story on a podcast, to give an interview. I declined them all. This wasn't a performance. This was my life. But not everyone saw it that way. Scott showed up on my doorstep 3 days later. He didn't text first. He just arrived, knocking quietly, as if trying not to wake something. I opened the door and found him standing there, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. He looked less like my son and more like a man who'd been caught in a story he didn't understand. He asked to come in. I stepped aside. He sat at the edge of the couch like a guest in a house he used to call home. He didn't touch the tea I offered. He didn't meet my eyes when he said, "You made us look like monsters." I said nothing. He explained about the post, about how it had gone viral, about how people were messaging Sarah's work email, about how Emma's classmates had seen it and were asking questions. He looked at me like I held a match over everything he had built, but I hadn't lit anything. They did. He asked why I'd done it, why I hadn't just told them how I felt. I wanted to laugh, as if I hadn't spent years doing just that, in 1,000 unspoken ways, in meals, in phone calls, in invitations, in the care I had wrapped around them like a second skin. He was only asking now because the damage was public, because the breaking wasn't quiet anymore. When he left, he didn't hug me. He said, "I just wish you had handled it differently." And I thought, so do I. I wished I hadn't needed to make that video. I wished I hadn't been left alone at a table meant for 7. I wished the people I loved had seen me before strangers did. But wishes don't change the breaking. After he left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank screen of the television. I thought about how strange it was that something so quiet, so personal, could explode like that. That truth, when finally spoken, could create more mess than the lie ever did. But maybe that's the nature of breaking. It doesn't come with applause or comfort. It comes with fallout. They wanted to move on, to patch it up, to pretend it had all gotten out of hand. But I knew better. I had seen what lay beneath the surface. The cracks weren't new. They had been there for years. The video didn't create the fracture. It only made it visible. That night, I took the video down, not because I regretted it, not because they asked me to, because I no longer needed it. The damage had been done, and so had the truth. I didn't need to keep showing it. They would never unsee it. It was the following Sunday when Scott came back. He didn't call ahead this time either. I heard the familiar sound of his truck pulling into the driveway and the engine cutting off just before dusk. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a pot, watching the trees sway through the window. The sky was the kind of gray that hinted at snow, though it was still too early for that. I didn't go to the door right away. I waited. I dried my hands slowly, folded the towel neatly, and took one last glance around the kitchen before making my way to the front of the house. He knocked once, quietly. When I opened the door, he was standing there with a foil-covered dish in his hands. He looked tired, older somehow. Not physically, but in the way someone does when they've been carrying the weight of their own choices. He didn't say anything at first, just held the dish out in front of him like an offering. It was a pie, pumpkin from the smell. The crust was uneven, the edges crimped hastily by someone who didn't know what they were doing. I took it without a word, turned, and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind me. He followed. We stood in the kitchen for a moment in silence. I set the pie on the counter and looked at it, then at him. He cleared his throat, looked down, and then pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded note. He placed it next to the pie. "I wrote it," he said. I figured, maybe you'd rather read than hear it. I didn't pick it up. Instead, I opened the cabinet and pulled down one of the plates I had used for Thanksgiving. I cut a small piece of the pie and placed it on the china, then pushed it gently toward him across the counter. No words, no invitation, just a gesture. He understood. He sat down at the breakfast nook and began eating slowly, awkwardly. I could see the effort in his hands, the way he held the fork too tight, like he was trying not to drop it. He chewed carefully, as if tasting guilt, not cinnamon. I stood across from him, arms crossed, leaning against the sink. When he finished, he looked up at me. His eyes were glassy, but he didn't cry. Not the way he had when he was a child. Not the way he used to when he scraped a knee or lost a game. These tears, if they came, would come from deeper, from something far less fixable. He stood, wiped his hands on a napkin, and stepped toward the door. "I won't ask for forgiveness," he said, "but I wanted you to know that I see it now." I didn't answer. He left. I waited until I heard the truck pull out of the driveway before I picked up the note. It was short, barely a paragraph. Apologies stitched together with soft language, careful admissions, subtle regret. He didn't try to explain, which I appreciated. There were no excuses, just acknowledgement. At the bottom, he had written, "I hope one day you'll want to share a meal again. If not on a holiday, maybe on a Tuesday." That line stayed with me. That night, I made myself a small dinner. Nothing fancy. Leftover roasted vegetables, a piece of chicken, a glass of wine. I ate it at the table by the window. No candles, no music. Just the sound of the wind curling around the house and the faint creak of the floorboards settling beneath my feet. I thought about all the dinners I'd hosted over the years, the laughter, the clatter of forks and knives, the way the house felt when it was full. I thought about the empty chairs, the untouched food, the way I'd smiled into silence to keep everything looking whole. And I realized something. That dinner with Scott, awkward, brief, quiet, was the most honest meal we'd ever shared. There were no placemats, no performances, no pretending. Just a slice of poorly made pie and the fragile beginning of something new. Not forgiveness, not reunion, just truth, served plain and warm. I spent the next few weeks tending to my home as if it were a living thing, as if it too had survived something and needed to be cared for gently. I dusted places I hadn't touched in months. I washed the curtains, rearranged the bookshelves, and repotted the old fern that had been clinging to life in the corner of the living room. I changed the linens, polished the windows, and scrubbed the grout in the bathroom tiles until my fingers ached. It wasn't about cleaning, it was about reclaiming. I wanted my house to breathe again, not with the heavy air of waiting and disappointment, but with the kind of stillness that comes when you no longer expect someone to ring the bell or ask what's for dinner. It had always been my home, but I had spent too many years making it ready for others, preparing it like a stage, making sure everything looked just right, hoping they would notice the effort, hoping they would feel something when they stepped through the door, appreciation, gratitude, love. But now I was the one walking through the door. I was the one noticing. I began lighting candles for myself, not because someone was coming over, just because I liked the way the flame flickered in the late afternoon. I put music on while I cooked, not to create ambiance for a guest, but because the quiet melodies made the room feel full in a different way. I started eating at the dining table again, not curled up on the couch or standing by the sink. I set a single plate, folded a napkin, poured a glass of water with lemon. Some days I read during dinner. Other days I just looked out the window. The birds had returned to the feeder I'd neglected all fall. I watched them come and go, sparrows, cardinals, the occasional bold blue jay, tiny lives fluttering against the cold, seeking warmth and sustenance. I understood the simplicity of that need. December crept in quietly, bringing early evenings and long shadows. I pulled out my box of winter decorations. For a moment, I hesitated. Would I bother this year? Would I string the lights along the porch? Would I hang the wreath? But then I did, slowly, thoughtfully. Not for them, for me. I baked cookies and brought a plate to Mrs. Landry next door. She'd lost her husband that spring and had become a familiar figure on her front steps, staring into the middle distance. She smiled wide when she saw me, invited me in for tea. We sat together for an hour, two women in their 60s, no longer waiting for company, but becoming it. Word of the video had mostly died down. A few lingering messages came through, strangers wanting to share their stories or ask how I was. I didn't answer most of them, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I didn't need to relive it. I had already done the work, spoken the truth. Everything beyond that was just noise. Sarah never called. Rachel sent one long email that I read and never replied to. Emma sent a Christmas card with a hand-drawn heart and a note that said, "I miss your mashed potatoes." I put it on the fridge. Scott texted a few times. Small things. "How's the garden? Did you see the snow coming?" I answered when I felt like it. I didn't owe him more. I didn't hold a grudge, but I didn't offer a return to what was. One afternoon, I stood in the center of my kitchen, surrounded by the scent of bread in the oven and a soft tune playing through the radio, and I realized I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Whole. Not because someone had made it right, not because they came back with apologies or grand gestures, but because I stopped waiting for them to fill the space they had once occupied. I had filled it myself, with truth, with boundaries, with care. I didn't throw another holiday dinner that year. Instead, I invited 3 women from the library to come over for soup and cornbread. We sat around the table, trading stories and laughter. Our lives different but somehow familiar. There was no performance, no need for perfection, just warmth. And when I looked around that night, at the flickering candles, at the chipped plates and mismatched mugs, at the hands reaching for more bread, I felt something deeper than celebration. I felt home, not a place built for others, not a space stretched thin by hope, but something solid, rooted, real, my home, my rules, my rhythm, and I knew, without needing to be told, that I had finally arrived.